I think one also has to remember that there are people on the far other side of the spectrum who are now mobilized, and we saw them at Charlottesville, we saw them on January 6th, who would also dearly love to break the system down. So one has to be careful not to hand them the opportunity to do exactly what it is they want to do. They are looking for it. The groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers who go out on the street to, get it on with the Antifa, they want to do a lot more than that. And they showed us their hand on January 6th.
Good evening. I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Fort Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program, Taking Stock, Biden's Equity Agenda, which is the fifth program in our Spring 2022 series, Governing in Crisis, Biden and the Looming Midterms. Upon assuming office, President Biden proposed an ambitious equity agenda designed to address systemic racism, gender, ethnic, and economic disparities. 1 year into his presidency, we will examine his administration's efforts to address these priority areas, which have been stalled by a deeply divided Congress. This evening, GBH's new senior investigative reporter, Phillip Martin, leads a panel discussion to examine the present impact and the future fate of Biden's equity agenda, the fierce backlash, and how this is likely to influence voter enthusiasm in the looming midterms. The series is presented by the Suffolk University's Department of Political Science and Legal Studies in collaboration with Fort Hall Forum at Suffolk University, the Washington Center, and GBH Forum Network. I'd also like to recognize the Lowell Institute, whose generous funding makes programs like this possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce Christina Coolidge, a faculty member in the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University. Christina?
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everyone back to the fifth of our course for everyone. The topic tonight is one I'm really excited to discuss and to delve into, and it's something that's on the mind of a lot of political scientists and certainly a lot of Democrats looking down the barrel of the gun into the looming 2020 midterms. There is a really widespread perception that the Democrats are going to lose control of the House and Senate and seats at all kinds of levels. At one point, well, at one level, that's not unexpected, that's not unusual. The party of the president in office typically loses ground in midterms, right? So it's a pattern. Only two presidents in the modern era have managed to beat that pattern. So on one hand, that's kind of the expectation, but the question is, will Biden have a shellacking the way that President Obama did? And if he does, what will that do to the fate of his campaign promises? And what we're particularly concerned about with tonight his equity agenda. So I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Cheryl Clyburn Crawford from MassVote, Gregory Freed, who is a professor of philosophy at Boston University, Tanisha Sullivan, who is the president of the Boston chapter of the NAACP, and Phillip Martin, who is going to moderate tonight from WGBH. Phillip, dive right into the conversation.
Christina, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank our panelists and the students, and of course, faculty and representatives from the Fort Hall Forum and everyone else involved in tonight's discussion. And it is a discussion. We're going to have a conversation, folks, to talk about a pivotal issue. In the title itself, we see two words that really jump out at me. Of course, the first is equity. that almost has to be redefined in the context of the moment here in the United States. The second word is crisis. That word is particularly important as well, because it describes where we are. We're not at a point of compromise. We're not at a point of any type of, if you will, a normal reconciliation and checks and balances within politics that we've seen in the past. The processes toward reaching consensus seem to be really uncharacteristically, if you will, astray, impossible to, it seems almost impossible to reconcile. And so we'll have that discussion. If you folks remember, and when I say folks, I'm talking about every one of you out there, you can probably remember where you were about a month from now, 2 years ago. After the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, there was this reckoning that was taking place throughout the country, where people were actually addressing an issue that was before not recognized as an issue, that is systemic racism. And with the election of Joe Biden as president, it was assumed that we would basically go beyond that point, and that systemic racism, the discussion of it, would be accompanied by policy solutions and prescriptions. It's a question now, are we there? Where are we in terms of the Biden administration's equity agenda in the years and months after the election? And I'd like to turn to our panel with that question and ask you in encapsulated form where you think we are in terms of Biden's equity agenda. If you could sort of sum that up in 2 minutes. I'm going to start with Cheryl and then go to Greg, and then that same question to Tanisha. Cheryl?
Great. Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for such a timely conversation. And as you mentioned, that's really on a lot of people's mind of what's coming up during these midterms. When I think about where we are with, where's Biden with his equity agenda, the lens that I look at things through is voting. And when I think about Biden administration attempted to pass 2 critical pieces of voting rights reform during his year in office, and they both failed. And that's unfortunate. You know, the first one was the Freedom to Vote Act, which would have done so many great pieces. If, for instance, it would have instituted mail-in voting and early in-person voting, election day registration nationwide. And I'll talk about a little bit more in the conversation, but how all of these reforms really tie into really providing equity in our communities. So where is he? He failed on those 2 pieces. Unfortunately, he was not able to get them passed. And well, you know, given the partisan nature of Washington, D.C., we really did not think it was going to pass, and it didn't.
Greg?
I think his equity agenda is in serious trouble. It depends a bit on what one is talking about in terms of equity. There's economic equity, there's racial equity, there's gender equity. And I think that the failure, as Cheryl said, to pass the voting rights bills is a very serious setback for American democracy, because we have seen the vigor with which the Republican Party has sought to constrain voting since the fall of Article 4 or Title 4 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that's gone into hyperdrive since the 2020 election. And we've seen that the Republican Party has sustained former President Trump's claims about the 2020 election being stolen. And so I think we're at a very, very dangerous impasse, crossroads for the United States right now in the 2022 elections. We will see what comes of it. I don't think anything is guaranteed. On the brighter side, I do think there are some aspects of the equity agenda that still hold out hope. Biden was able to pass the American Rescue Plan, and that did have some important elements. My hope is that he can succeed, but I think the chances are receding, but succeed in getting the Build Back Better plan passed, at least some version of it, because I think that the $400 billion that are set aside for childcare and the $150 billion for affordable housing are vital issues of economic equity that indirectly but substantially affect racial minorities in our country. So I think there are ways of addressing racial equity that are not directly head-on confronting that by name, but are successful and important if implemented and benefit all Americans. So I'm hoping that if he has success on that front, it will put some wind under his sails for the 2022 elections.
Tanisha, how do you feel about all of that? And the question of progress, equity, and conflict, crisis, if you will.
So there are a few points that I want to double click on here and then talk about where I do see some windows. So first, it is important to acknowledge that the Biden-Harris administration took office with a bold equity agenda, and one that was multidimensional in terms of the topical areas: education, economic opportunity, climate justice, public safety, certainly voting rights and access, and health equity. And there were and continue to be some advances on that front. And specifically, just picking up on Dr. Freed's point, we've seen advancement when the equity agenda has been tied. We've most readily seen advancement when the equity agenda is tied to some economic movement, right? So for example, the CARES Act, as was mentioned, ARPA funding, the infrastructure bill, all of those pieces of legislation were able to move with bipartisan support, with significant funding supports, I believe because they were tied to an economic foundation, if you will. Where the challenge remains is that when the dollars funnel to the states, when the dollars are expended at the federal level, ensuring that those dollars actually do reach the most vulnerable populations, whether we're talking about BIPOC communities, low-income communities, working-class communities, immigrant communities, that's really where the rubber meets the road. I think in terms of being able to advance legislation that has the potential to have an equity impact, we have seen some progress there, but we really won't know about the impact until those dollars are spent, when we'll be able to assess who actually gets the dollars. Now, that's the bright spot. Where the administration has not been able to make the type of advancement that, quite frankly, I would argue helped to really put the Biden-Harris ticket across the finish line, are in the critical issues of public safety, and as Cheryl mentioned, voting rights and access. This is important to note because in so many respects, there was high expectation that with holding Congress and holding the White House, that the administration actually would be able to get some of these very important civil rights pieces of legislation across the finish line. And quite simply, they have not been able to do it. Although I will give the Biden-Harris administration credit for using the executive pen when it comes to some public safety and law enforcement advancement. That said, where do we go from here? I do think it's important to note that, there is very slim majority, as we know, in both the House and the Senate. As Christina lifted up, it is very likely that there will be a shift in the balance of power, if you will, in Congress. And so one might think that the opportunity, the window to further advance equity might be closing. I think it is critically important that over the next 5 weeks or so, that we really, that Congress really does lean into the opportunities that remain to advance an equity agenda that really does get to those civil rights and social issues that still the business that still remains undone. That's voting rights, that's public safety, so policing reform, and I apologize, I left off climate justice, environmental justice, and climate justice. Again, missed opportunity there to really make some bold advancements, but we still do have a little bit of time over the next 5 weeks leading up to 6 weeks leading up to the Memorial Day break.
Yeah, let's discuss this more. Those are all important points all of you have made. And I like the notion, of course, talking about the bright side as well. Let's talk about the not so bright side for a minute. And that is the very climate that we're in right now.
Yeah.
When you're trying to advance equity and you're up against not just the mechanics of Congress and a very hostile opposition within Congress, that basically sees its role as oppositional in non-compromising. The question becomes, how do you advance equity when the term itself has become problematic for some people? For some people, equity, diversity, inclusion, as we saw in a local election here, Braintree School Committee, have become metaphors for anti-white in the view of some individuals. So getting to this issue of change, what are the alternate ways of basically advancing Biden's agenda? And I ask for alternate ways because the House might be able to pass legislation, and they have. But you have a Senate that is not in step with Democrats, not in step with each other within the U.S. Senate. We don't have to revisit Manchin and Sinema, but they, of course, represent that wing of the party, which is not on the same footing. So, having this discussion, what are the alternate ways, in your views, of advancing an agenda that is up against cultural and political headwinds that seem difficult to overcome? Anyone, please.
Well, one thing I would cite, and maybe Tanisha or Cheryl can back me up on more of the details, but one thing that was interesting in recent years was that there did seem to be some bipartisan support in Congress around prison reform. And it was possible to get that both from the Democratic side and the left Democratic side to the Republican side, because there was a convergence of interests. On the Republican side, a recognition that these were very expensive institutions that were not achieving their purposes. So that might point the way to much more fine-tuned targeting of specific policy items that could get across the aisle support without being labeled as part of the equity agenda, which seems to play right in to the culture wars that we're having now, and that forces, especially on the Republican side, people to dig in their heels because they don't want to be seen as soft on critical race theory or something like that. So I think that's a very delicate thing to carry off because we've become even more polarized recently. So I don't know what the chances of that are. But I think things like support for childcare, which is vital for women's interest, vital for poor people's interest. That's something that could potentially cross the aisle if one pitches it in terms of a family agenda, right? Support for American families, the child tax credit, things like that, which do contribute to equity, but don't have to be pitched on those terms to be successful politically. That would be my bright side.
So I'll pick up here. I do think, again, the understanding the intersection of economic justice and racial equity does present a very real opportunity to advance an equity agenda. And we've seen that, we've got evidence of that over the last 12 months or so. But I think there are two things for me, Phillip, on this point. One, I do believe our goal should be, when possible, bipartisanship, right? And ensuring that we are advancing legislation in a bipartisan manner. The concern I have in this moment is that in order for there to be true bipartisanship, everyone's got to come to the table, with a true centering the issues, with being solution oriented, and in good faith. Yeah. And it seems to be, and you're right. I mean, we've seen Republicans and Democrats, advance issues, Dr. Freed, right, related to public safety, prison reform, criminal justice reform, education reform, climate justice, voting rights, right? So it seems in this moment that this idea of bipartisanship has become politically weaponized in a way that has really served to create deeper divides in Congress and across our country. And so I believe that it is incumbent upon us, we the people, to really push back against that, and really kind of call it out for what it is, and make it clear that we do want to see bipartisan resolution and solutions being brought forward. I think and as a result, I think one of the greatest opportunities that we have, particularly here in Massachusetts, to see that happen, is at the state level. I think, at the state level, we do have the opportunity to advance aspects of the Biden agenda, through how we spend, again, kind of those federal dollars that are pouring into the Commonwealth, and ensuring that from an allocation standpoint, that the most vulnerable communities, our BIPOC communities, our low-income communities, working class families actually see those dollars pour into our neighborhoods. That, I believe, will present one of the greatest opportunities for us to see, for us to see, and for Biden to experience some real meaningful progress on the agenda, the federal agenda.
It's interesting, and Cheryl, state by state, as on a state level, as Tanisha mentioned, that might also be the alternative way of reaching some type of consensus in terms of voting. Or if people just have to figure out, they might have to go along with the program that has been basically constructed largely by Republican legislators in states like Georgia, and basically outperform the expectations of those who figure that if you're standing in line long enough, you'll call it a day. Or those who have determined that if you can't mail in your vote, you give up. That might not be the case for many people. How do you see it on a state level, as an if you will, as an alternate way of trying to establish or reach some priorities that the Biden administration has laid out for equity?
Absolutely. Great question. While we're talking about state laws, as Biden failed to pass it on the federal level. There's so much that they couldn't do, but here we can do it on the local level. And as the states started rolling back all of their voting bills and accessibility to voting, all these egregious laws that over 27 states have implemented. I think about here in Massachusetts, there are a number of steps that we can take to make voting more accessible and equitable. Specifically, we have a long called on the Massachusetts legislature to support the passage of the Votes Act, right? Like when I think about the Votes Act, which came about really during COVID, because COVID shined the light on everything, right? Like it just really ripped the Band-Aid off and really made people become more aware of the systemic racism that exists in every piece of every, right? Like of our lives, housing, education, voting. And voting in particular, we were unable to get the Votes Act passed permanently. We're looking to pass it, again, bipartisan, even on the state level, because that's where it really begins, or even on the local level in our city councils, right? This is where we really need to cross the aisles and really come together to pass these bills, because they're for everybody. Everything has become so politicized, so negative and so politicized, and just we're unable to come together to get not real sense bills passed. The Votes Act, of all the reforms under consideration, election day registration would do the most to make our elections more equitable. So I think about it's on the local level, because if the federal level can't do it, each individual state has to do it. But because of the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the rolling back of all of these laws, it's unfortunate that so many states are coming up with these bad laws that are really making it less accessible when we're trying to move forward to make it more accessible in a bipartisan way.
Cheryl, can I ask you a question to follow up on that? Are you suggesting that Massachusetts is in a position to model some kind of depolarized, cross the aisle political action on these kinds of questions that, with some luck, can provide a model for the rest of the country for how to address these things sensibly and without the partisanship that we see is so extreme now?
Good
Exactly. I think, yes, there is that opportunity for us to do that. Massachusetts is supposed to be on the leading edge, right? The cutting edge, doing all these amazing things. They say we're a blue state. I really know we're not a blue state. We're a purple state, and we don't want to get into that. But, right, but there is an opportunity for us to be the example, to be the ones to pass, to pass these laws in a way that shows the rest of the country we can do this. This is not a partisan issue. This is a civil rights issue, right? A civil rights issue for us to be able to have access so that everybody has access equally, right? Like there's equity in our voting laws. So I think Massachusetts is in a great place. We're trying to get this, it's in conference right now. The Votes Act is in conference right now. And we're doing everything that we can to help them understand, the legislature, understand that this is a bill that we must get passed, right? Like, and show it's already in 21 states. It's not like EDR is it's the first, Massachusetts is going to be the first state to bring about EDR or SDR, same day registration, election day registration. We're not the first ones to do it. 21 states already have it, including Washington, D.C. So we're in the middle of the pack, but we can do it right. And each individual state can choose to do it the right way.
Phil, can I jump
Please,
in?
Tanisha, go ahead, please.
A couple of points. So one, again, kind of the states need to, and we need to be watching what the states are doing, particularly as these dollars flow into the states, how they're allocated. We need to be watching very closely what the states are doing, as many of us are, on the issue of voting rights, not just those states where there's active suppression efforts, but as Cheryl has pointed out, states like Massachusetts where there are attempts to advance, right? But in addition to that, I think there are a few other strategies that could be implemented at this time to help move legislation, public policy forward, both at the federal and state level. One would be, just thinking about the legislation that has been the social justice, racial justice, civil rights legislation that's been put forward at Congress. It's been omnibus, right? It's been full packages with everything, right? And so I do think what we might see, and what I'm hoping we see, are kind of bills that come forward that seek to advance and prioritize certain components. Right, of some of these larger packages. So when you think about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, yes, all of the reforms that are included in the act, I believe we do, for the most part, limited exception. But to have that work sitting on the shelf, recognizing that there has been bipartisan support, law enforcement support across the board, community support across the board for some form of police misconduct registry, right, that would help all of us to know where the bad apples are, because nobody wants bad apples. Looking at an opportunity to advance a component of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act might be where we can see a win. Likewise, when we think about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, yet another one where we know, again, the reforms in that package need to be debated, should be voted on, etc. However, when we think about the real impact that the holdup of that package is causing, a lot of it reverts back to Section 5. And the fact that, the Supreme Court has put back in the corner of Congress the responsibility of modernizing the pre-clearance formula.
Yeah,
that's right? The Supreme Court. That's the Supreme Court's modus operandi these days. They're throwing everything back.
Exactly. And so from my perspective, I think that there is an opportunity, and I'm hoping that we see there again, Congress taking up, if nothing else, taking up, responsibility for modernizing that pre-clearance formula, because what we know is that in years, all of the other reauthorizations, we've been able to do it on a bipartisan level.
Yeah.
I think also, I just want to say also, that's an excellent point, what you brought up, Tanisha, around these omnibus bills that we put together. I think people hide, right? I think it's time for us to vote on them separately. They bring them forth in a pack, vote on each piece separately with a voice vote, right? Like, so you can see, so that people in the community can see who's voting against these pieces of legislation. Right, like instead of this whole blanket thing, because I'm thinking about the Votes Act. Nearly 2/3 of Massachusetts residents support EDR. More than 100 advocacy organizations. The Massachusetts town clerks support EDR as well. The state Senate has voted in favor of EDR multiple times, and the entire Massachusetts congregation has voted in favor of EDR. So why don't we have EDR? It makes no sense. And I think because they vote for it in a pack, that people don't get exposed. And it's time for us to rip the Band-Aid off of all of this and really show where's the hiccup in all of this. Why are we not getting things? I know it's not, people say, it gets a little sketchy. I know, but it's time to expose people because we keep hiding and we never get anything done.
Right. So I think that's exactly right. I think we need to beat the bushes and see what's really going on. And if we're talking about the 2022 elections, the voting public needs to see that. And the problem, as Tanisha said, with the omnibus bills is that the public gets a little numb to the omnibus bills. But if you have it focused on the elements of those bills then the public can understand what's going on in each element and can identify who's supporting it and who's opposing it. Which brings us back to another issue, which is how bad has the polarization got in the country?
Well, I was going to actually raise that. Allow me to frame it this way, Gregory, in terms of that very question. Looming in the background always is January 6th. Looming in the background always is a president whose framing of his election defeat is that he actually won, and that everyone else who assumes that he did not is under some delusion. But yet, a full 1/3 of the country accepts his proposition, his premise. So, in that, continue with your answer, Greg, and with that in mind, January 6th looming and a presidential frame of reference that is delusional. A former president's frame of reference, I should say, that is delusional, but yet is accepted by 1/3 of the nation as somehow truth of extraordinarily Orwellian proposition.
Well, it is a true crisis. You know, beware the old adage, may you live to see interesting times. We are in historic times right now. And it's interesting that you use the word looming for January 6th, because it's in the past, but it's also in our future. And that's very serious, that 1/3 of our country swallows this big lie. The degree to which propaganda has been successful in our public discourse is beyond scandalous. It's terrifying. And so that's why I ask this question. What could be achieved in terms of bipartisanship a few years ago, if you zoomed in on some very specific issues rather than these omnibus bills? I just wonder politically whether the bloody mindedness has advanced so far that making small policy gains, they're not small for the people affected, but in terms of the broader political ambition of the party, and I'm really talking about the GOP, did they be willing to sacrifice any successes with new laws in order to make the Democrats a party of failure before 2022? And I think we see that everywhere. If we just look at the fact that 147 Republican members of Congress voted against certifying the 2020 election, that's a sign that we are on the edge of an abyss. And 2022 may be when we tip over the edge of that. I don't want to be a crisis monger, but I think it would be foolish not to recognize how dangerous the situation is at this point.
Tanisha, Cheryl?
Yeah, it centers, I mean, at the core of this is information, and information that can be trusted. We have gotten to the point in our society over the last 5-6 years where the veracity of information has to be questioned all too frequently. And so I do believe it's important, and that's real. So yes, you know, 1/3 of folks believe that there was some form of voter fraud in 2020. That's the belief, when the data is very clear that is not the case. I do think this is, you know, Phillip, I think this is, you know, where we see increased need for the integrity of media, of journalists, journalistic integrity, and ensuring that that we are doing all we can from a structural standpoint legally to ensure that journalists, not the media, journalists, actually
good differentiation.
have access to the information needed to do that robust investigative journalism. So that, right, so that the public, so that we, the public, have information that we can trust and then act upon.
But isn't the problem that the public is completely divided in where they get their information?
Absolutely.
From Facebook, from Fox. It doesn't matter if they're great investigative journalists telling the truth if people are from the get-go refusing to accept that evidence.
So here's the thing. We will always have, I think at this point, we have to learn to live with that tension.
Yeah.
Right. But at the same, because we've allowed it to just permeate really. But at the same time, I'm the optimist here, right? And when it comes to this thing we call democracy, at the same time, we cannot yield ground. We cannot yield ground. We have to continue to shore up those structures and those institutions in our democracy that have the greatest potential to ensure that truth that continues to be put into the public square. We have to continue to invest in education, both traditional and at the grassroots education, to empower people and give people the tools to access information that can be trusted. If we give up that ground, then I do fear what can and will happen going forward, because information is a key to this whole thing. And so we've got to figure out how to live with now the very real tension of misinformation, disinformation that by design is meant to divide us.
And let me say this, and Cheryl, I know you want to get a word in too. I think at this point in our conversation, we'd like to hear from the students. No doubt they too are intrigued, interested in this very topic that we're talking about. So let's bring the students in. Then let's Abby, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here tonight. My question is for Cheryl. So in one of our first webinar episodes, law professor Gilda Daniels stated that democracy needs a level playing field in order to work, which we currently don't have. She said that advocating for voting rights bills, such as the John Lewis Voting Act, to be passed will help us confront the erosion of our democracy. In your opinion, what can the Biden administration be doing in order to help move these efforts along?
That's a great question. And to her point, and that was where I was going to pick up with this misinformation, disinformation. There's so much, the racism is so institutionalized within all of our systems. When I'm talking with young people, you know what they want to do? They want to break up the whole system, tear the whole system down, because this is a system that was created that didn't even include us from the beginning. And so we built on these institutions that did not include, provisions for people of color, Black people, brown people, women, right? What can we be doing now really to continue to pass legislation? I think, he started out correctly, wanting to pass legislation with bipartisan efforts, right? And I think that that's something that we need to stay on, right? We're going to have to keep pushing to help people understand, but at the same time, understand that we need to pass these pieces of legislation through bipartisan efforts. But at the same time, we need to be looking at these systems more thoroughly, breaking them down where we can. We can't just break down the state house yet. But we do need to figure out another system that will work for us, that is more inclusive for all of us.
Good question, great response. Not sure if Greg or Tanisha want to pipe in on that?
I beg your pardon,
Did you have something to add to that?
Well, I would just say that in terms of the extraordinary frustration that Cheryl described in people that she's talking to, and the wish to break the whole system down, I think one also has to remember that there are people on the far other side of the spectrum who are now mobilized, and we saw them at Charlottesville, we saw them on January 6th, who would also dearly love to break the system down. So one has to be careful not to hand them the opportunity to do exactly what it is they want to do. They are looking for it. The groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers who go out on the street to, get it on with the Antifa, they want to do a lot more than that. And they showed us their hand on January 6th. So I think people have to be careful what they wish for about the breakdown. It may come to that, but I think we have to remember the 400-year history of this country and remember what happened when those folks were let loose, when the dogs of war were let slip. It doesn't end well, alas.
So I do want to just, I'm sorry, Phillip.
Oh, that's all right. You go ahead, Tanisha, if you make it short. I'm just looking at our time here.
I will make it.
Yeah, I can remind folks that we'll likely go over, if that's okay, with you and the students. Excellent.
I'll make it
Tanisha?
quick. Yes. And so I think a couple of things, we shared a little earlier about some of the ways that perhaps we could move that voting rights, the advancement of voting rights can move forward at the federal level. I did get a private message. Someone asked me to explain pre-clearance in a nutshell, hopefully very simply put. In the Voting Rights Act, there were certain states based on past practices, past voter suppression practices that were subject to what we call pre-clearance, meaning they would have to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department prior to making any changes in their voting laws. Okay. The Supreme Court shut that down. They didn't shut down the idea of pre-clearance. What they said is that we needed to essentially modernize the pre-clearance formula. And so Congress needed to take certain steps to ensure that the formula that is used for pre-clearance is actually appropriate for the times. Okay. Again, I was asked to explain this from someone in the chat. So just to make sure that everyone understands this. And the reason that is critically important, pre-clearance, think about it. If we had a modernized pre-clearance formula, then that would likely mean that some of the voter suppression, what we consider to be, many of us consider to be voter suppression efforts at the state level, could likely be subject to a federal review prior to them being able to just be ushered through state legislatures like we've seen in Georgia. Okay, so pre-clearance, and that's one of the reasons why I lifted that one up as a potential carve out from the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, as one that we might want to prioritize, and quite frankly, that the Biden administration should be prioritizing because of the impact that it would have not only at the federal level, but at the state level.
It would be restoring what the Supreme Court took away. Friends, Leisha, let's beautiful name. Let's hear your question.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to the panelists for your time tonight, and also thank you to Professor Coolidge as well for the opportunity. My question is for Professor Freed. While I was taking a look at some of your work regarding the challenges to liberal democracy, one of the things that you pointed out was the challenge of ethno-nationalism. So my question to you is, what is the most prominent example do you consider to be happening now in the United States?
I'm going to give a rather dark answer to that question, because we can look at the Proud Boys, we can look at the Oath Keepers, and the 3%ers who attacked the Capitol, and think of them as ethno-nationalists out on the far extreme. We can think of the March on Charlottesville as ethno-nationalists. And before I say what I'm going to say, let me start with this. My first political event was going in 1976 to the Gerald Ford Victory Party in Washington, D.C., with my father, who was a Republican. And my father was made the Solicitor General of the United States by Ronald Reagan in 1984.
Wow.
So what I'm going to say now is maybe shocking, but I think the largest ethno-nationalist movement in the United States right now is the Republican Party. I think they've thrown their hat in that ring. You see it from all the data about why people are voting for somebody like Trump and supporting all of these voter suppression efforts across so many states of this country. I think that something has happened deep in the psyche of the United States that broke. And it would take a historian and a sociologist of far greater genius than I to explain what that is. But something very dark in the soul of America has broken out in these last few years and has taken over one of the once great parties of these United States. So, I know I'll catch a lot of flack for that, but I think the evidence is clear that when you have a presidential candidate like Donald Trump, who bases his campaign on denying the very legitimacy of a man like Barack Obama as an American, to deny that there's a racial animus animating that party is, I think, beyond credibility at this point. So I don't know. I don't know if that will satisfy you as an answer. Is it France Alicia? Is that how we pronounce it?
Yes, it's France Leisha, like Paris.
France Leisha.
Yeah.
It is a beautiful name. So thank you for that question. I'm sorry to have to give such a distressing answer.
Thank you for the answer.
I'm afraid the reality is distressing. And we're going to move to, I'm looking at our remaining time, we're going to move to Terrell, and then we'll hear from Shauna. Terrell, your question.
Hello, thank you, panelists, and good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My question is for Ms. Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan, as the current president of the NAACP Boston chapter, I'm interested in your opinion about the tide of restrictive voting legislation at the state level. According to the Brennan Center, as of January 14, legislators in at least 27 states have pre-filed, introduced, or carried over 250 bills with restrictive provisions, a 39% increase since last year. In your experience, how do you think proponents of expanding voting rights can best combat these attempts to make it harder for underrepresented voting groups?
So I'm going to be the echo chamber on the pre-clearance formula. It is not the silver bullet, but I do believe that it can and will help to ensure equity and anti-discrimination in any voting law that is passed. And so at the federal level, we've got to keep pushing until that is addressed. At the state level, I think there are a few things, and Cheryl touched on this a little earlier. I mean, we need to, and certainly within the civil rights community, one of the number one civil rights issue for us in the civil rights community is the protection and advancement of voting rights, like period, full stop. And the reality is a lot of our energy has been focused nationally within the civil rights community on really trying to hold the resistance line against the active voter suppression efforts in many states across the country. And we need to continue to do that using every tool in the tool chest, whether it's, coalition building and negotiation, bipartisanship, and yes, even litigation, if and when necessary, because the threat to our voting rights is an existential threat to our democracy, and we've got to throw everything we have at it to ensure that we're fighting up against voter suppression. At the same time, I think it's critically important that we are working the other end, and that is looking for opportunities where the political ecosystem is ripe to advance voting rights, so that those states like Massachusetts and others can really help to pull the tide in the other direction. And as we seek to advance voting rights, whether it is, as Cheryl mentioned, passing the Votes Act here in Massachusetts and same-day voter registration and mail-in balloting as a threshold, or it is exploring truly the advancement of voting rights to ensure greater accessibility, language accessibility, for example, which is critically important. So we need both protection against, resistance against the suppression efforts, as well as really leaning into and championing the advancement work that is happening across the country.
Sure, thank you. Terrell, thank you. Shauna, you have the last question. And let me just remind everyone, we're going to go over, not by much, but we'd like to get some other issues in, including climate change. John?
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, panelists and Professor Coolidge, for being with us tonight. Philip, my question is actually for you. As a journalist today working against a flurry of disinformation, as we've been talking about, and as someone with an undergrad degree in journalism, I'm wondering, how do you remain committed to the truth without letting diminishing trust in the media evoke cynicism in your work?
Oh, Shauna, great question. The truth is it's like that old adage, it will set you free. And it is so important, especially as our panelists have pointed out, we're seeing a deluge of misinformation and disinformation from abroad. The misinformation right here within our ranks, that is to say citizenry, and disinformation, the damage that can flow from that is enormous. And so I remain committed to the truth because I know that obviously even if 1/3 of Americans are committed to hearing their truth, or as one former Trump official said, the alternate truth, there might not be a whole lot you can do about that. They might be committed to that type of framework of assumption, and that might be their reality, and they're committed to that because it conforms with their ideological bent. And I never thought I would say it, that you may be in a situation where you cannot win over those people. So I'm committed to winning over those who can be won over with the truth. Those who still believe in data, those who still believe in objective reality, as ascertained through fair reporting, as ascertained through data, through studies, through polling, those things still matter a lot to me. It's what fuels me. It's what keeps me awake. That's why I wake up in the morning ready to go. It's a battery. I'm also concerned, I don't think what Professor Freed said is alarmist in the least. I am concerned about where we are heading, not just in the United States, but worldwide. I am concerned about a revanchist philosophy and a movement that's taking place in Europe. I am concerned about illiberalism transitioning to authoritarianism in the United States. I very much believe that could happen. And we would not be honoring history. I'm not talking about revisionist history, real history, if we did not believe those things could happen. They certainly can. And journalism is not necessarily a bulwark, but it is protection to some degree from the worst excesses of those type of movements. Those illiberal movements, those efforts to basically end multiracial democracy, which is a relatively new feature of our democracy in the United States, multiracial democracy, a post-1960s model of democracy. We sometimes think about those things as being here forever, but it's relatively new. And I'd like to keep it. So journalism, I feel, is one way of doing that. Law is another way. Teaching is another way. There are a lot of approaches to trying to ascertain and maintain the truth. And the truth, I think, is important to quite a few of us.
Amen.
I hope, Sean, that answered your question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If I may pick up on what you just said, Philip, I think we're at an inflection point globally now along this clash of illiberalism versus liberalism. We see that transpiring right now in the Ukraine. And Ukraine was not yet a perfect democracy, but clearly they were on that trajectory. And that is precisely why Vladimir Putin wants to end them. He's invested a tremendous amount of energy over the last 2 decades in undermining Western democracy, supporting movements like the Brexit in England, far right-wing nationalists in Europe, such as Marine Le Pen in France, Viktor Orban in Hungary, illiberal regimes. And I don't think we're immune to that, far from it. I think we could stumble our way into that very same thing as well. And it's clearly what Trump wanted to do during his coup attempt on January 6th. Is imitate his hero over there in Eurasia. So I think what we're facing as our challenge in America is it's a bit like what Cheryl was saying before about Massachusetts. We have to stand up for democracy and voting and the key elements of a multiracial democracy here in Massachusetts to provide a model for our country. But our country also has to stand up for the sake of the world right now, because if we all falter, a curtain will fall that will take us all with it. And I'm frankly terrified of that.
So this is real. And I think there are a few things that really come to the forefront for me. One is, again, and I appreciate Phillip, you kind of putting into the space that, we're still relatively young at this thing here, right? This is still an experiment, this democracy, this American democracy that we all have the opportunity to live in. And as a result, in order for it to do what we all hope it does, and that's deliver on the promises of our Constitution, freedom, justice, and equality for all people, like we've all got to continue to work at it. We can't get lazy with it, right? We've all got to continue to work at it because it is still young. When we think about should I just put the gravy in there? Civil rights advancements, when we think about women's rights advancement, when we think about the advancement of the LGBTQ movement, these are all within some of our lifetimes on this line. Okay, we're not talking about hundreds of years ago. We're talking about 5 decades-ish.
Yeah.
Right? And so that means that it is still all of this work that we've done together, really believing and hoping that this democracy thing in America could work for all of us. It's still young, it's still new. And so it is fragile. And so I am just as concerned as everyone else has expressed concern about where we are today. But I'm also deeply committed not to allow that to be the lead, right? The fear and the disappointment. Because when we think about, and Phillip, you said it, when we look back at history, if we had allowed fear and the divisiveness and the disappointment to lead, we would not have seen the Civil Rights Act. We would not have seen the advancement that we've seen in gender equity or the LGBTQ rights in our country. So we really do have to, in this moment, recognize and be honest about where we are and how much of a danger zone we are in, crisis we're in. But we've also got to double down on the hope and commit to putting that hope in action to save this democracy.
I just want to say, I want to chime in just for a second here to say that we have to look to our young people, right? Honestly, right? Every movement we've ever had has been led by young people. So I'm really excited to see the students on this panel this evening asking their questions, engaging as I'm old school, right? As I am willing to pass the torch, the reins to the next generation and us leading them and guiding them, advising them, but letting them take, not us leading them, letting them take the lead and us advising them. And I think that's where hope comes in for me, that this next generation is standing up and saying, we can't do this anymore.
This is fantastic. It's been a great discussion, and we're not quite through yet. I'm thinking there's some great questions still to be asked, but we unfortunately don't have the time for it. So I'm wondering if the Ford Hall Forum, if Suffolk University can perhaps take these questions and send them to Tanisha and to Greg and to Cheryl, and because questions about CRT absolutely important. But I do have one final question before I ask you, if you will, to wrap this up within a minute each. And a final brief question, and hopefully a final brief answer, is about how do you address climate change in an equitable fashion, in your view, given that it is oftentimes not seen, its effects and how we are dealing with it seen as inequitable, i.e. FEMA, for example, responding in disproportionate ways to those who've been affected by hurricanes and fires and tornadoes in the country. Let's start with Tanisha, go to Greg, finish up with Cheryl, and then in that reverse order, let's get your 1 minute summations.
So I am disappointed, I have to say, with the outcome of the most recent reconciliation bill. Missed opportunity to really advance climate justice in this moment, and looking forward to the ongoing fight to ensure that we are making the investments we need to make to protect our climate and our communities as a result. As it relates to equity in this space, I believe it's important for us to center people alongside place. I think oftentimes in the conversation, people get left out, and so it goes to your point, Phillip, right? And so we should be centering people. And when we center people in the climate justice conversation, then we do get to racial justice, because we understand that oftentimes the disproportionate impacts in economic justice, the disproportionate impact of climate change adversely affect low-income communities and communities of color at higher rates. And so I'm hoping that as the conversation expands, as we advance public policy in this space, that we are ever mindful to center people, humanity in the conversation, and as a result, that we will get to greater equity in our policy making.
Tanisha, actually, let me go to Cheryl, because I remember Cheryl said she had to leave fairly early. And so let's your answer to that question, and perhaps a quick summation, if you will.
Well, there's not much more, I think, that I can really add to what Tanisha has already brought out in terms of centering people and really making sure that we keep in mind who is really being affected by us not addressing this. And it's the same folks that are typically disenfranchised, right? Our communities of color, low income citizens. But if we're all going to survive on this planet, we had better start really taking a look at this whole climate justice issue. But yeah, that was great, Tanisha, what you said, put forth around that and how we should be looking at this. And as I'm parting, I just want to absolutely say thank you all so much. It's been my pleasure to be on this panel this evening with Greg Freed and Tanisha Sullivan and you, Phillip, and the rest of the team and all of the students from Suffolk and of course, Rachel Cobb, my go-to as well as the rest of the team. But the thing that I want to encourage people to do is to reach out to us, the students that are interested in advancing some of the issues we talked about locally. We at Mass Vote are available. We bring on interns. We bring people into our space that are willing to do some of the work with us. And these bright minds, we could always use these bright minds at our table. So I want to again thank everybody for having me this evening. And yeah, we're on to something good here.
Well stated, Cheryl. Greg?
Beautiful. If I'm to speak to the climate change and equity, what I would say is to just come back to something that we discussed earlier, which is maybe to pull some of the threads of these omnibus bills, like the Build Back Better bill, and target some very specific things that actually benefit people directly, and that with a little bit of coordinated work can really make a difference. So we do know that pollution and climate change affects the poor and the disenfranchised most thoroughly. What if we were to really push electric vehicles for the public transportation in our cities, because the pollution that comes from burning gasoline is toxic to our communities? What if we were to give people really major tax deductions for purchasing electric vehicles to encourage that production in a way that would benefit the American family? What about making it much more attractive for landlords and individual homeowners to purchase solar paneling for their homes, so that we can target it at a much more micro level of American economic life? Because I couldn't agree with Tanisha more. The way to deal with equity issues is to find common ground on economic issues that all Americans can see the benefit of. And that would be my answer to you, Phillip.
I even heard the canines in the background agreeing with you, Greg.
I have two. They want me to give them a walk.
Tanisha, summary?
Oh, I would just say, thank you for the opportunity to engage in this conversation. I got a lot out of it and thoroughly enjoyed our time together. I would echo Cheryl's comments. Please feel free to reach out to us at the NAACP if you'd like to learn more, get involved, continue the conversation. But again, thank you for the invitation. Outstanding conversation.
Okay, and I'll throw this back to Christina. Thank you. I thank my panelists. It was just fantastic conversation.
I didn't get my wrap up. I just spoke about climate justice, and
Go for it.
I don't think I can add very much more, except what a pleasure and a joy it was to meet the other panelists, to get back in touch with my friends at Suffolk and the students, and to meet you, Phillip, and to try to find those germs of hope that can buoy our democracy. I think that's what everyone should take with them. And for the younger people watching this, to remember it's in your hands, and to seek out resilience for yourself and the communities that you are part of, and to engage in whatever way you can in public life. And that's the way to fight against despondency and fear, because those things will get us. And that's where I would leave it.
Indeed.
Then I guess
Thank
that's
you.
where I pick it up, which is again to echo thanks for our panelists, our amazing moderator, and especially for your engagement with our students, which I can't tell you how much we appreciate. It is something that is transformational for them. This was supposed to be a little bit about the midterms, and we actually never got there. So maybe you'll come back and talk to us about how progress or lack thereof on Biden's equity agenda is going to impact turnout of key communities that were in his coalition that elected him to the presidency. Now, the midterms are clearly not about Joe Biden, but they are about Joe Biden.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Right. It's about members of his party. So can I lock you in for another episode?
I'm at your service.
Sure,
Indeed.
I'd love to do it.
All right.
I'm
awesome.
ready to go for the second hour, Christine.
Yeah, me too.
I found it really, really hard not to jump in like every episode, but that's just me. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to our students. Thanks to our wider audience. Thank you for your attention. And please tune in to the last episode of this series, Pulse Check, Can Biden's Party Beat the Odds?, where we will very definitely be talking about the horse race, the polling, and the history of midterms, and whether or not the president's party can beat the historical odds. Good night, everyone.